Now, there's so many reasons why January 6th and what happened yesterday have some things in common, but are radically and fundamentally different. All you need to know is a little bit about Brazil in order to see that that's the case. This has been true for many years now, where when Jair Bolsonaro emerged mostly out of obscurity to become a leading presidential candidate and then become the Brazilian president, the American media had no ability to understand who he was except by immediately comparing him to Donald Trump, going so far as to invent a nickname for him, Trump of the Tropics, that demonstrated they have no capacity to understand the world except through reference to their monomaniacal fixation on partisan politics in the United States, and specifically on Donald Trump. There are some stylistic differences between Trump and Bolsonaro. They're obviously demagogues on the right. They have a good political talent for riling people up. And I think Bolsonaro consciously sometimes copied some of Trump's stylistic techniques. But Brazil and the United States are very, very different countries. They're very complex countries with a very different history. And to simply casually equate them that way because you have no way else to understand the world, and to interpret every event outside the United States as a reflection of your own simplistic partisan framework, as we just saw CNN and so many other journalists today doing, reflects an inability to think about the world except through this kind of cable news framework of Democrats versus Republican and right versus left, when there's so much more going on than just that. Now, to begin with, let's take note of the fact that the protest that happened in Brazil yesterday took place on a Sunday, as opposed to on a Tuesday as happened in the United States, which meant that no one was in these buildings that they entered. There was no Congress in session. There was no Supreme Court in session. Lula da Silva, the president, was in Sao Paulo on a publicized trip to visit a part of that state that had suffered from intense storms and where homes were being washed away. So there was no objective purpose to interrupt any kind of process, nor was there any objective to prevent the inauguration of Lula da Silva, as many had predicted might have happened, and as was the case on January 6th, when they went there in order to prevent the certification of election results that those protesters regarded as fraudulent. Lula was already peacefully inaugurated on January 1st, the day before Bolsonaro left the country in order to go to the United States, almost certainly in part because he feared the possibility that he might be criminally charged. But whatever his reasons were, he hasn't been in Brazil since the inauguration, and there was almost no organized effort to stop the inauguration on the day that it happened. What had actually happened was there were millions of Brazilians who did come to believe the election was the byproduct of fraud. And in large part, that was because Bolsonaro spent the year encouraging them to think that, saying that the election processes could not be trusted, even though they're the same ones that led to his election in 2018, and even though they're the same ones that in the first round of voting on October 2nd led to an extraordinarily successful night for the Bolsonaro movement. Bolsonaro's party became, using those voting machines, the largest party in both the House and the Senate. Bolsonaro's party and his allies took over the governorships of the two most important states by far in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, as well as numerous other state houses and governorships around the country. The Bolsonaro movement had an incredibly successful night on that first night of voting, and Bolsonaro himself wildly surpassed and exceeded the predictions of leading polling firms in Brazil that predicted he would end up with 34% or so in the first round of voting, and he instead got 43% and finished only 5 points behind Lula. But he did encourage people to believe that there was widespread fraud that was likely in terms of interference with the voting machine. He attempted to get paper ballot backups, but that was rejected by Congress on the grounds that there was never any real doubt before about whether or not these election machines were reliable. But there was mounting frustration on the part of Bolsonaro supporters, both before the election and after, that his very narrow loss, Bolsonaro lost to Lula very narrowly by barely 2 points on October 30th, was the byproduct of fraud. And you began seeing around Brazil large demonstrations of Bolsonaro supporters outside of notably military bases, where they were encouraging and urging the Brazilian military to intervene into Brazilian politics and declare the election the byproduct of fraud, and either order another election or simply declare that Bolsonaro was the rightful winner and reinstall him into a second term. And had Bolsonaro done what Donald Trump did, which was come out on the very night that the election results were certified and instantly proclaim that he was the victim of fraud, and then pounded the pavement every day after that, insisting that fraud was the only reason he lost and encouraging his followers to go out into the streets, the potential for civil unrest, even civil war, was very real in Brazil. We saw just a glimpse of that yesterday. And the fact that numerous parts of the armed security services in Brazil, including various sectors of the police and unknown numbers of battalions within the military, were sympathetic to Bolsonaro generally and politically, numbers of, and perhaps his claim that the election results were the byproduct of fraud, made it a very volatile situation for sure in this transition between the October 30th election certification of Lula as the rightful winner of the election and the January 1st inauguration. And had Bolsonaro lit a match, you would have seen a gigantic flame being burned. But Bolsonaro didn't do that for reasons that I think are still a little bit mysterious. What he did instead was basically disappear. He gave a statement, a written statement, the next day after the election, when his supporters were already in the streets, clearly ready to protest angrily, blocking the streets using trucks. Truck drivers were a big constituency of Bolsonaro, and he told them to stop doing that breaking the law and impeding business in Brazil was an illegitimate means of protest. He said, this is what the left does. I don't think we should be doing that. And then after that, he really just disappeared from public life in a very strange way. He just stopped making political appearances, even though he was still officially the president of the country. We heard for a while that he had an infection on his leg that prevented him from putting his pants on. But whatever happened, there was very little from Bolsonaro. And so this movement that was assembled behind him and clearly ready to act at the slightest instruction was kind of left leaderless. And I think more than anything, that was the reason why we didn't see any real disruptions or violence or civic strife. We saw lots of protests, but not anything like we saw yesterday, but in much bigger numbers, like I think we would have had Bolsonaro manifested and encouraged his supporters to come out on the street and protest what he believed was his illegitimate defeat. And then, in the middle of all of this, thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.